Okay, everybody, I think if everybody's okay, we can go ahead and begin tonight's continuation of our discussion on rates. Jerry Askew is here, representing the KUB commissioners, and we appreciate that. Want to remind everybody that since we're streaming the meeting, you've got your button and see mine is green to push when you speak to make sure everybody can hear you electronically. And unless anybody has any changes to the minutes, let me ask you that were circulated. Those are acceptable. We'll go ahead and consider those to be the official record and move on. I guess we'll go right to Mike Boland to continue the rate discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you. I noticed there's some faces today that wasn't here last time, so let me just introduce myself. My name is Mike Boland. I'm Vice President of Utility Transformation, and under my purview is rates, our rates group, and actually started with KUB in the rates department 30 plus years ago. And have spent a lot of time with TVA over the years. So just as a way of background there a little bit. And before I get into my presentation, I want to say a couple things. First of all, last time I talked about Terry Ledford as having a great deal of rates background. He's represented the Associated Valley Industries and talks with TVA on their rates for many, many years. He's the president of Associated Valley Industries, as well as representing UT, and so he's represented large commercial and industrial customers for years and years and years. Dr. Smith has represented the environmental interests for a number of years in rate proceedings at TVA, as well as on IOUs, and I would use that term, y'all might not know what that is, but regulated utilities. And the person I missed, though, was saying, recognizing that Erin Gill has her own experience as well, maybe not with rates, but Erin has served on some groups, either the Integrated Resource Plan, the Regional Resource Plan, I don't know, with TVA, and I was remiss for not recognizing you, Erin. I apologize. So. Okay. Well, so anyway, there's at least 3 people that have quite a bit of interest or knowledge about some of this stuff to start with. So I apologize for that. Secondly, I thought last time maybe I lost some people, and I apologize for that. We'll try to not do that. I'll try to be a little more deliberate on our discussion tonight. So for those of you that weren't here, last week, really, we kind of went over KUB bills. And what does a KUB bill look like? In particular, residential bills. And that's going to be the focus of all our talks, really, is about residential bills. And as a reminder, the bill typically consists of 2 pieces: a basic service charge, which people call fixed fee, and then a usage charge. And we have 4 utility services we provide, and each of those 4 utilities have their own fixed fee, basic service charge, as well as usage rate. Each of those utilities have a little bit of different rate design, or rate characteristics, if you will. The energy utilities, gas and electric, both have a seasonality component to their rates because our energy supply costs have a seasonality to those costs. So that's reflected in the rates. As a reminder, the basic service charge that you pay on each utility consists of 2 different parts, or 2 different groups of costs, if you will. The first is what I'd call customer costs, which are the costs to read the meter, the cost for billing, the cost for the call center, the cost for the meter itself. Then the other set of costs that are built in the basic service charge are the capital costs necessary just to provide the incremental basic turn on the lights, power comes on type costs that's sitting there as an investment to serve you. So those are the 2 costs that go into the basic service charge. The last thing we talked about before we broke was the fact that if you look at KUB and our customer base, about 50% of our customers only have 1 utility from KUB, whether it's electric or gas. Those are the 2 predominant utilities that only have 1 customer. One service in their deal, only 16% of our customers have all 4 of our utility services. So that's a pretty interesting statistic that most people probably don't really recognize. So we wanted to bring that up as well. So with that, and all that really is kind of a background basis to kind of get people set into KUB and its rates a little bit. And pretty much everything I talked about last week was already on our website, about here's your bill, here's the components of your bill, understand your bill. All that stuff's out there on our website and has been on our website as well. So I was just kind of going over that. I think tonight really is where I start talking a little bit more about rates and how they fit into things. Probably not tonight. Another night we'll probably actually start talking about KUB and KUB's rates and KUB's rate history and how our rates compare to others. So that's to come, but it won't be tonight. We're going to be talking a whole lot more theory kind of stuff tonight, I believe. So with that, let me get started here. First, if you think about rates, and everybody's here to hear about rates, to me, rates is just one piece of a utility's financial plan. A utility, when we're looking at what we're going to do, we look at a lot of different pieces. Obviously, we provide a utility service. And in providing that utility service, we have capital costs, we got energy costs, and those kind of costs. And the question is then, how do you pay for those costs? And a utility, by definition, is a long-lived asset sort of deal. So when we invest in things in a utility, we're looking for a lot of things that have lives like 50 years, like a power pole have a 50-year life. There's cast iron water mains out there that have a 100-year life. And we don't need to pay for 100-year life assets in rates right away because it's going to have a 100-year life. Why shouldn't people for the next 100 years pay for that asset? So you do that by taking on debt. So the debt allows people to pay for it in the future generations that are getting the benefit of the future generations. You don't pay for everything that's your budget is this year from rates this year. You use debt to kind of spread that out over time so more people can pay for it. So just like rates is a component of how a utility works, debt is as well. And you would find that just like TVA, everybody's heard about TVA and their debt. KUB has a lot of debt too. And again, it's used judiciously for the purpose of making the rates more palatable, and it's also more fair because future customers will pay their share instead of the current customers paying everything. Two other things that we utilize to help with our budget and deal. The first one is growth. If we weren't growing or we don't grow, all of a sudden you got cost pressures that you otherwise wouldn't have. If you're not growing, then any escalating sort of costs are spread over a fixed base, and by definition almost, then you'd have to have cost increases almost just to cover the escalation in costs because you don't have anybody else to kind of bear the burden, if you will. So customer growth is a real good aspect to a utility. And last but not least, cost management. Honestly, the first thing that our board and executive staff challenges us to is making sure that we're judicious with the customer dollars. And cost management is a way of also meeting our budget guidelines. So with that, I don't want you to focus necessarily on the numbers here at all, but this is the electric 10-year financial plan. And we could do this, we have such a plan for each of our utilities, gas, water, and wastewater as well. And as a utility, it's different than many other industries because there's such a long-range view on it because everything we do has a long life to it. We're also able to plan out what our debt needs are. We're able to plan out our rate needs as well through a financial model. And this plays out in talks with our board every year. And in fact, I guess the longest running thing that we do with the board really has to do with this right here, or what is the budget that they feel comfortable with us having. And then the discussion is, okay, if that's the right budget, then what's the right way to finance that budget? Now, y'all may or may not know this, but KUB is unique from a lot of companies. The uniqueness is the fact that we're a public utility. In other words, we don't make a profit. We don't have shareholders. That's not part of any of these numbers up here is not a line item of profit that goes to somebody to enrich them. Everything up here is just a cost that's used in providing service. So that makes us a little unique in how we do things and how we look at things as well. So everything that up there that we have and all the assets that we have belong to our customers. They're not somebody else owning some of these things. So the only motivation we have is to provide the appropriate service that our customers expect and deserve at a rate that is as low as we feasibly can, given the level of service that we want to provide. So you'll notice on here, and we've highlighted just a few items on here, that the big item on here, of course, is a long-term debt, a rate increase, and then a lot more information about bonds as well. And in the next slide, I actually go into a little more detail on some of that stuff. Here's a different way of looking at the current electric long-range plan. There's a lot of things you can look at this and see. I think all y'all were involved in or aware of the fiber plans that the electric division has and is rolling out. It was just approved through a lot of different people over the past summer. And you can see it in this plan if you look on the capital. You see in 2022, the capital level is at $97 million. All of a sudden, 23, it jumps up to $132 million. And then for the next 7 or 8 years, you've got another $40 to $50 million worth of investment there. And then in 29, it goes back down. My guess is, and somebody correct me, this is all the fiber build out, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And okay, so we're going to spend all this money, and I'm sure y'all know exactly how much that is, but it's a whole lot of money. $702 million. And are we going to pay for that with rates? That's a good question, right? $702 million. The reality is that if you look over here, the plan is to start issuing a lot of debt over the course of this period of time to help pay for that. And you can see the total bonds in electric go from $320 million to, at the end of the fiber build-out, $572 million. So you're going to issue an extra $250 million or so worth of debt, looks like, to me. A good factor on looking at a utility is also how much of the utility is funded by debt and how much of it is funded by rates. If you had zero debt, then all this capital right here would have to be funded by rates, and everybody's rates would be otherwise higher. So the number that you feel comfortable with financing with debt helps drive rates. So there's two things that drive rates. The first one is the budget. If we did not spend this amount of capital right here, we wouldn't have the need for as much rates. If we spent more capital than this, but we could borrow more money, we could have flat rates. So what we charge customers ultimately in rates is a function of the budget and the amount of debt we feel comfortable with using to cover our budget. That's kind of two fundamental things. Yes, sir.
Good question. KUB's broadband service will probably come in lower than the private market to some degree, AT&T and whatever. And my understanding is that EPB actually has made a fair amount of money off of their broadband. So clearly some of that's going to go back to pay off the bonds. Do you anticipate that the fiber network and the broadband will actually put downward pressure on your electrical rates? Because that's what I think is happening at EPB. And are y'all forecasting that?
Yes, that is really represented in the rate increase forecast. Once you get beyond those 3%, which in part were to help fund the build out of that fiber network, one of the reasons we're able to forecast, in particular in those latter years, no rate increases is because of the revenues that we're forecasting to come from the fiber division to the electric division for use of electric system assets, things such as that. And hopefully well beyond that 2031 year. So it wouldn't be so much in the form of a rate decrease, but making sure or helping to ensure there wouldn't be future rate increases, much like I think what's been the case with EPB.
Right. But is there a level of penetration with the broadband that is effectively revenue neutral relative to rates? Or is there a level that if you exceed, it could actually lead to lower electrical rates? And have y'all contemplated what that penetration rate is that could actually, because it seems to me that that is a selling point, because with AT&T, you're never going to get, it just goes to their shareholders, right? Whereas if you have a certain level of penetration in the community, if you guys make that visible, you could actually see where people's electrical rates come down, because I think you're assuming a relatively modest.
35%.
Yeah, that's pretty low. Given that you're going to have a higher quality at a lower price. I understand being conservative, I'm not knocking that, but it seems to me there's a high probability that y'all will be able to exceed that. Although I did notice AT&T finally got off their butt and is putting fiber in my neighborhood.
Yeah,
But
down near my area, yes.
but it seems like that you could actually see where you could put downward pressure on rates, and that generously you could actually forecast potentially at a certain penetration rate where you could bring the rates down.
That is a potential to the extent that we exceed that 35% rate, and depending upon what the financial impact of that is as far as more revenues coming into the electric division than we forecasted, that would be, I guess, a potential,
Yeah, but you're not communicating that, because again, it seems like a selling point. Sign up with KUB. If we get to 50%, you may actually see your rates go down. That's a strategic advantage marketing over what AT&T, you're never going to see them do.
yeah. Okay.
So I guess, how often do you go back and revisit your budget to recrunch the numbers and say, yes, we got money in, and so let's go back and increase this, decrease that?
There's an annual budgeting process that we go through.
We update our long-range plan each spring, yes.
That's gone through, annually. And just to be honest with you, I appreciate Dr. Smith being an optimist. I got it. This guy, he's not. He's a conservative, right? So, I mean,
Goes with the territory.
his role is to make sure there's money in the bank to pay bills. So I appreciate his role in life. But clearly, as things play out and maybe things turn out to be differently, then all of a sudden all these numbers sort of change. We have not borrowed all this money yet. We have not spent all this money yet. This is a plan, and the plan will change as we go through time. So, but funding.
One last thing, Mike. I
Yeah.
just want to make sure. And it's probably useful to share with the other folks, and I'm getting out on thin ice here, but my understanding is that the electrical relationship you have with TVA is that there is a limit to sort of cash on hand that you guys can have accrued. Because I know that Jim Cooper, the representative from Middle Tennessee, at one point was getting after a number of the LPCs a number of years ago about the fact that they were amassing large amounts of excessive revenues. And so can you talk a little bit about, is there a point at which you guys, now obviously you can gold plate all these things and you can spend that money in some ways, but I mean, at what point do you begin to amass enough money that, being the optimist, maybe certain things go well, at what point are you sort of obligated under your relationship with the contract with TVA, and TVA is quote unquote your regulator to some degree, that money has to be returned back to ratepayers?
I suspect you're right that there is a point at which TVA might step in. The reality of my 30 years or so here is that our board would be stepping in long before TVA did. They're the ones that set our financial strategy and make our decisions on an annual basis. And I just can't foresee any of them having rates or things higher than they felt comfortable based upon the circumstances.
Yeah,
And cash is certainly a function of a budget. If you go back to the more detailed model here, you'll see that the general fund balance, this line right here, across through here. As part of the model, they've kept it pretty constant over time, which is basically the amount of cash you need to have on hand to keep from overdrawing your checkbook. That's their target cash level, and everything else plays around that. And if that number starts drifting upwards, let's say this number, instead of 15, next year it was $30 million, well, gosh, I would be shocked if Mark didn't come in and said, hey, instead of borrowing 54, why don't we use some of this excess cash here, and we'll just borrow $44 million.
Yeah.
So I can't speak for what others have done. I can speak for what we have done historically and how I think it would play out if we were in a position to have extra cash. That it would just change the whole financial plan. This thing is not written in stone, and it would be adjusted. The same way if we had some unbelievable bad storm and a bunch of expense, all of a sudden the next year we may have more expenditures and we'd have to adjust things. If we had a gosh awful good year and we had more money, we'd adjust things the same way. So.
And what is EPB's penetration rate on their fiber?
I think it's around 70%, yeah.
So it's twice what y'all are forecasting.
Can I ask, I was going back to the general fund and the rainy day fund. We hear a lot about this in city government. The general fund balance of that 15 million that you're targeting, is that above and beyond that tornado reserve emergency fund?
Yeah,
or
the
is-
general fund balance, that is general fund at $15 million. That is something that
That's-
has developed over time, and we believe that's appropriate to help
Yep, just kind of keep
offset
cash flow.
those types of things. We also have contingency cash reserves, which don't show here, which I believe are 90 days of operating expenses, which is pretty standard.
Yep.
So we don't really, beyond what you're seeing there and beyond what we feel we're required to keep in contingency cash reserves, that's pretty much what we have.
Yeah,
We
so
don't
you're
have-
looking at
We don't have a
contingency-
slush fund above and
Yep.
beyond that
Yeah.
of $30 million.
And for
Yep.
those of you that, to me, $15 million, well, I could retire. That sounds like a lot of money. But,
What, 10th of your
the electric
budget?
division
Yeah.
Yep.
has total revenues of $600 million. Okay, so $15 million is a big number, but,
Yeah.
in the big scheme of things,
Because if you
that's
look
not
at
too much.
the line item below the general fund, the annual margin on power sales, to the extent that you had a mild summer, a mild winter, and the sales are much less than what we've anticipated, that margin can drop. Well, that means those $15 million cash numbers are going down as well. So we have to adjust in some way. If we're going to continue the same level of expenditures, we got to make up that difference somehow.
Yeah.
And that's maybe doing a little bit less capital, less O&M, what have you. Obviously, you could issue more
debt.
debt or raise rates, which
Well, I mean, I could give you a good example. If we go back, and I go back too far, but if we go back to like 2008, and y'all correct me on the dates here, but around 2008, there was a recession, y'all may recall. And we had a lot of spending plans, and we had all kinds of plans to issue debt and everything else. And our board and our then CEO said, we're not going to do it. And we quit hiring people. We quit doing big projects. We did everything we could for 2 or 3 years there to recognize the fact that our customers were suffering, and we adjusted all of our plans accordingly. As time went by and things looked better, the board approved increased spending to bring back some of the projects that had otherwise been planned. You know, again, on a utility, there are emergency things that have to be done, but there's an awful lot of planned work, replacement work that just goes on that can be shifted a little bit one way or the other. So is that a good,
I think so,
did I get it
yeah.
right? Yeah.
And I think another point as far as the take rate being greater than 35%, and I'd have to go back and look, but I believe the expenses will also go up to some extent. There'd be a higher capital and also higher O&M expenses that would be reflected in the plan as well. So we'd have to take all that into consideration, obviously, to the extent that that does occur. But
Is there anything that is materializing now that we're beginning to get a better view on the infrastructure bill that is going to potentially offset some of the costs that y'all had projected that may be accessible through the federal expenditure?
I think we're
because
still,
broadband is part of it.
yeah, we're still looking at that, and that in particular would be a game changer. So for instance, if like maybe, you know, look what EPB got, if we got $100 million in federal funding to help build out the fiber network, yes, then you're talking about a rate reduction. Yes,
Right.
you got it.
But you guys are not on, you're not beaded on right now, locked on to something that is in the plan that you think is that order of magnitude? Or, I mean, what are y'all doing on your due diligence to try to identify that?
Well, we're certainly keeping apprised of what's going on with the bill, and also, I know on the state, some broadband funding for the
Right.
state. I think that's the focus now. We're waiting for more information and final rules on with respect to federal funding for the broadband, but we have a group, a planning team, that meets every 2 weeks to stay on top of that and what's changed over the last couple of weeks. So
Right.
we have our ears to the ground as far as what those potential sources of funding are, because yes, that's a big deal and could be a game changer for our customers. Yes, sir.
So that would be a rate reduction then if that came through and not a decrease in the debt that you're taking out for your capital expenditures?
Well, we would look at the whole picture, but if we got something of that magnitude, yes, there would be some form of rate reduction.
Well, and what we're talking about is a rate reduction from the increase. So it's 333, and my understanding is that if we were to get a windfall grant,
Yes.
it would reduce that 333. It wouldn't necessarily reduce it from what it is today, but it would offset the need for
That's
future
correct, and I'm
increases.
taking into
Yeah.
consideration those 3%, so
Yeah.
maybe that last one goes away, or goes down to 1%. We just
Yeah.
have to look at the magnitude of what the
Go back to
assistance
this
would
one.
be.
We can
Yeah.
talk about that easier.
Yeah.
I was on a meeting earlier today, Dr. Smith, to answer your question. Every utility in the state of Tennessee is lining up trying to get grant funds. So, I hope we get our share. We're certainly going to give it a shot, but it's not like they're directing their money to us. They're directing it to everybody. Everybody's going to have, trying to get their share.
But not everybody, not all utilities in the state of Tennessee are doing broadband.
I say everybody, but I mean a
Yeah.
whole lot of people. How about that? It's not just KUB, for sure.
But I just want to assure you that we're not asleep at the wheel on this.
Right.
That's a big deal
Right.
for us and certainly for our customers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask, before we leave kind of debt and whatnot, this is the electric long-range plan, and I flipped through, I didn't see a place where we talked about the total debt load of KUB. Do you want to throw that ballpark number out for us?
Yeah, what we have, I actually brought that.
Sewer one will make you.
I was going to say, there's probably a lot of
cringe.
zeros on
Gas
that
is
number.
great, sewer's awful. Water in the middle.
Yeah, what we have today is a little under 1.1 billion total outstanding debt. And probably about half of that, maybe a little less than half of that is for the wastewater system. A lot of heavy borrowing to help fund the federal consent decree, all the projects associated with that. Over the next 10 years, we're projected to peak at just under 1.3 billion in 2028. It sort of follows that trajectory there and then begin to gradually decline. So, and the other thing that doesn't show when we talk about the debt ratio is the interest cost that's outstanding with that. And we typically issue long-term bonds, 30 years, spread over 30 years. And so the interest cost can be pretty significant as well. So for example, I think right now in wastewater, we have about $500 million in outstanding debt. The interest tab on that is over $300 million. So the level of interest rates also factors in to the timing and how much we would borrow. And we've been very fortunate as this debt has increased, and Mike has charts, maybe that's next
Yeah, we'll talk
installment
about that in a minute.
on this, that it's been almost a historically low interest rate environment, and that's really helped benefit our customers in the debt borrowing, keeping the cost of borrowing down. And refinance. We refinanced last March and saved $80 million.
So Aaron, your question is really good, particularly if you put it in a historic sense, and Mark didn't talk about that, but if you go back to the early turn of the century, the millennium or whatever?
Early 2000s.
Okay, go back to early 2000s. I bet you we didn't have $100 million between all of the systems. Is that?
We probably had more than 100 million. I would say it's probably around a little in the 250 range, something like that. Yeah, because wastewater was about 50 when we started the consent decree.
Well, and we also added in all the other utilities as well, and that's part of our discussion as we get through time here is, okay, what has happened with KUB over the past couple of decades? Yeah. And that's part of the big story right there, so. That's cool, I like that. Terry Ledford's went off a while ago. It was a duck call, so. Well, actually, I wasn't necessarily finished with this slide, so you may be finished with it, but let me finish my story. Let me finish my story here. Again, the big deal takeaway here is that we finance ourselves through a combination of debt and rates. And so a good thing to ask is, why is this number 44%? Why don't we have 95% debt and 5% rates? I mean, mainly debt financed. And as we sit here today, I think we are either AA plus. I don't know if we're a AAA on any of our utilities.
We are in water, but we're AA on electric.
We are as a bond rating goes, we're the kind of investment grade type bonds that we have, which allows us to borrow at a cheaper rate than if we had lower bond ratings. And so part of keeping a good bond rating is a question of this ratio right here, and it's also, more importantly, probably this ratio right here is how many times your net income is a multiple of your max interest rate, max interest
debt
cost,
service, yeah.
Debt service over time. So there is a method to kind of coming up with how much debt we feel comfortable with, how much debt our board feels comfortable with. Although I'll tell you, over the years, our board has challenged us from time to time on what is the appropriate amount of debt, challenged us, particularly in the wastewater days, to take a look and stretch ourselves on how much debt to take on. Having another big utility in this town, having debt issues over time, made people skittish about taking on debt, but that's a factor. The amount of debt we have is a factor of how much rates we have. They play together on funding what our budget is. So I probably beat that to death now. So if there's no more questions, I'll move off this slide. So now we move from, we've gone through a plan. The plan has what our budget requirements are. The budget has been looked at, and there's been a decision made about how much of the debt we're going to issue, and at the same time, how much rate income we need in order to balance that budget. Again, there's not another party out there to get money from in the form of shareholders, so it's either debt or it's rates is where the money comes from. So when you start thinking about changing or setting rates, this is a slide that we pulled from the American Public Power Association, of which we're a member, on starting out and thinking about rates and rate studies. And the American Public Power Association, we are a public power utility ourselves. We don't have shareholders. American Public Power Association represents utilities like ourselves. There's about 2,000 of them in the United States. All of TVA distributors are either like us, municipal public power utilities, or they're cooperative public power utilities, if you will. The co-ops have their own association, the municipals have their association. Ours is the American Public Power Association. So anyway, I'm going to use some of their slides along the way here to show what our industry has taught us and talks about here. So we copied this slide, and one thing that's interesting about it, if you have good enough eyes to see the thing down here at the bottom, APPA copied this from AWA, American Water Works Association, which is the water equivalent to APPA, and there's also a gas association called APGA. And it's pretty interesting. You know, when we think about rates, there is a box that we have to play in. You know, that box is determined by, okay, there's federal and state laws and regulations we've got to meet when we're thinking about rates. A good one is like TVA. TVA's got guidelines that kind of sets a lot of things about our rates and our structure, and our policies even are governed by TVA. The next one in their pyramid here is bonds. And our bonds, when we issue debt, they're bonds, what they're called. And those bonds have pledges in them that we have to meet in order to have our bonds not be in default. And those pledges might be things like, you shall not give away service, for example. You shall do lots of different things, and that's Mark's job again on knowing about that. But there are legal constraints there as well. You have policies that the board has and principles as well. Part of the policies the board has is the idea of what's the appropriate amount of debt, what's not the appropriate amount of debt. That's kind of driven from our board level of what's the appropriate mix there. Certainly there's guidance from executive staff, but honestly that's ultimately their policy. And principles, principle typically will be on the lines of people pay their fair share. But so there's a lot of constraints around the whole thinking about rates, if you will, before you even start talking about rates.
Before you move over that, can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
That says it's from 2008,
Yeah.
and that standard, that has not changed.
Yeah, this
The
is just,
last- This is the breakdown of how it's done.
this is just a construct of how people think about rates.
Okay.
There are different constraints around what you're thinking, yeah.
Okay, and then when you're talking about the bond covenants, or like a covenant is like a promise.
Yes.
So thou shalt not.
Yes.
Why have those not been changed?
Well, those were adopted back in the master bond resolutions when they were first set up. And each bond issue you have, basically those covenants can continue on.
So nobody ever thought to go back in and say, thou shalt make a difference, that you change the rates for the people that pay them, not just the industries, or thou shalt not, you shall not make a law that keeps people from not being able to eat and pay their bill. Well, my question is, you say it's never been changed, it's always been there, it just goes on and on and on. whose job is it to go in there and look at those covenants and say, we need to change some of these thou shalt nots?
Well, the bond covenants, basically, they're in fact for all the bonds that we have outstanding, that $1.1 billion, those covenants apply to all of the bondholders bought the bonds based upon those set of covenants or promises, okay?
Okay, but that didn't answer my question.
Well, in order to change that, you have to wait for all those bonds are paid off until those covenants can be modified, basically.
Well, and I would say it's a little bit differently. Some of the things you're asking are things that are not in the bond covenants. The bond covenants are assurances that there's going to be, that the bondholders are going to be repaid. So they are interested in making sure we don't spend so much money that we don't have enough left to repay them. So that's what that's what those covenants are about. They don't so much tell us what to do one way or another. It's all about our financial situation is what they do.
That's right.
Okay, well, I'm just wondering, because when you said thou shalt not give away, so that means that some, who is, when you say the bondholders that you said that you set these laws by, I just don't understand why we can't go back in. There's some kind of way that, somewhere in that pyramid, there needs to be some change that helps the people that are paying the electric bills. Now, I may not be understanding it, but to me, when you say thou shalt not,
Well, the
There's
bond
gotta
covenants
be-
would basically say that there's an order by which you pay your expenses. So you have funds set up. You'll have a general fund set up, and the expenses that are paid first are your operating and maintenance expenditures, and then the cost of operating the system. And then your debt costs are paid, and then your in lieu of tax payments are paid. It's to help ensure that the bondholders get repaid. That's really what those covenants are. The one with respect to not giving away free service is actually one that's in the wastewater bond covenants that basically says as long as these bonds are outstanding, service will not be provided. You know, people will pay for the service that they use, basically. I paraphrase somewhat. And that was in the initial bond resolution when the city began issuing wastewater bonds. We took over the system from the city back in 1988. And it's just, it stayed in place all that time.
And Mark, I'm broaching a limb that I'm not comfortable on in finance world, but again, like knowing the types of bonds that we issue at the city, there are general obligation bonds and then there are revenue bonds.
Yes.
And so revenue
That's
bonds
correct.
are a specific type of bond that is directly linked with your commitment to bill for whatever service it is that bond is providing funding for.
Right.
Whereas we oftentimes issue general obligation bond, which says, we're not going to link it to any one source of revenue, but come hell or high water, we're going to get you your money. And in the city world, that usually looks like raising taxes. But revenue bonds are much more specific because they're linked with the revenue from the project that bond
Right.
is funding.
And there's, one of the covenants is a rate covenant, and the board commits, actually the city does too, since the city approves our bonds, the city commits that the board will do this as well, to set rates that are sufficient to recover the operating expenses of the system and also be able to pay the debt service cost out for the system. So for whatever instance we got in a financial condition where we can't pay that, then basically those bond covenants, the bondholders say you have to raise rates to be able to do that because we must get paid. But
That's a good way to look at it.
I think that's a
because
good
there is
way
no
to look at it.
collateral
That is
per
really
se.
what's providing those assurances to the bondholders, because I've given you my money, and you're going to pay me back over 30 years with interest, but I need to have some assurances that I'm going to get repaid, and that's what those bond covenants exist for.
But I think there's a deeper significance to the point that Dr. Shipe is raising, and I think a lot of us around the table here are actually here for that purpose, and from some of the remarks Dr. Smith has made, you can suss that out as well. In other words, maybe it's almost like a biblical injunction of thou shalt not. Don't hurt poor people. And so one of the things that we'll be looking at, and I don't really think in bond covenants we'll find a fertile ground for making a change that would help disadvantaged people in our community. But as we go through this whole conversation, I know for one, I'm looking for that. And trying to figure out exactly what we can do in this discussion that will help people who are hurting and also help them raise up their own level of economic activity.
Yeah, I don't think trying to modify bond covenants is an avenue by which you would want to accomplish that. I just,
But let me put a little different spin on this. You said it perfectly right. What the bond holders want, they want to be sure that they're
correct.
so, and I think what we need to tease apart is, can there be rate structures set up that still capture the same amount of revenue, but may take some of the pressure off some people who are struggling? And so as long as the same revenue is coming in, the bondholders are going to be fine because they're going to be taken care of, okay? We felt this, even though we didn't see it directly, and we can have a conversation about this. I'm not saying this to be combative, but when we were talking about the debate between fixed fees and rates, KUB went to the city council and to the mayor's office and talked about this may impact our bonds, because we were discussing language about how we wanted to freeze fixed fees. We were very careful, and we said it over and over again. The fixed fee is a component. We were not touching rates. We were fully supportive of KUB capturing all the revenue they needed in the variable rate, which would meet the obligation to pay the bonds. So what's got to be teased apart here is, where in leadership at KUB are you using these bond covenants or this implicit threat that somehow or another the bonds are going to be impacted, because that freaks everybody out. But yet, in actuality, as long as you've got the revenue and you can demonstrate that you're getting the revenue, the bondholders are going to be fine. So I think we need to be more sophisticated about how we talk about this, because it's the ultimate revenue that you're collecting. Even if you pull some of the financial pressure off some customers and maybe shift it around, or if you back off of fixed fees and lock them into a particular configuration and get your revenue from variable rates. So we need to make sure that we're not using the bond covenants for some philosophical reason as opposed to a reason that is really tied to the issue associated with paying the bonds back.
Right. I think.
Can I comment on that, Mark?
Sure.
I love the way you put all that, because it gives us a great opportunity to talk about the various components that we consider when we consider this rate. You're absolutely right that if the amount of revenue it takes to run the system remains constant, that you can charge it either in variable rates or fixed rates. If we had shifted away from fixed rates to variable rates, the people who would have been hurt the most would have been the poorest people who live in houses whose variable rates would have gone through the roof during the cold winter and the hot summer. So that's just a fact.
Well, I think that's one of the things we need to tease out, because I'm not really sure that everyone's data is consistent with that point. I know you all took that up as a talking point.
The data that we have shows that. So the board made its considerations during that particular conversation was to make sure that we didn't hurt the least of these. That doesn't have anything to do with where the heart is. The intellectual component of your argument is absolutely right, that we can't hide behind an intellectual argument. Nobody else can hide behind an intellectual argument. But in the case that you used, we would have been hurting the people we're trying to help.
Well, I think hopefully over the course, we'll dig into those facts more, because there's a lot of evidence that fixed fees are more regressive for lower income customers.
There is a lot of evidence on that, but on general, but on our customers, we ran the rates, and we know who would have been hurt, and it would have been our poorest customer. So, you know,
Well, and,
I love the conversation though.
Yeah,
But-
well, there's
but-
all kinds of ways to torture the numbers, and we'll have to get into it.
But just one clarification back to the proposed charter amendment. I think the argument we were making is about the potential impact on bond ratings as a result of that. And the key point there was that the proposed change in the charter would be taking potentially rate-making authority away from the board, that the flexibility that they currently have by which way to set the rates, by saying you'll do it this way or you do it this way. And that was our concern, that the rating agencies would look upon that as to say, okay, you've had a change in, the board doesn't have as much flexibility as they previously had in being able to set rates for how you charge your customers. That could be viewed upon as a negative and potentially could impact the bond ratings. That was the point that we were trying to make back, I guess, in summer of 2020, so.
Right.
It wasn't related to the
Again,
bond.
we were silent on rates. We were talking about the fixed fees.
Yeah, it was just the change in the potential, the governance, the less flexibility in the setting of rates, in the
Mark.
components of the rates. That was what was
Right.
driving that arguments.
Can I ask a question? Because I think this relates also to revenues, though. I mean, you, in your financial plan, the cool yellow small graph
Yeah.
that Mike showed,
I'll go back.
you have to, as a function of good management, project out your revenue. And it's upon that revenue that you make investment decisions, because that revenue has to cover your debt service, and that's the 3%. And you've got a lot of buffer there, which is good. Like, that buffer is bond rating material, and all that's important. Can you, in the very general sense, and again, I recognize that this is probably very fluid, can you at all help us understand the function of a fixed rate that's determined based on fixed costs like debt service versus variable costs like O&M and the amount the TVA is charging you? I mean, there are very variable costs that you incur, and then there are very fixed costs that you incur. How directly, and maybe this is where we're going, Mike, how directly do those things line up within your rate-making structure?
Well, I think that's the reason we're here, is to talk about those sort of things. So clearly, hopefully, we will be talking about that before it's over with. But at this point, I'm afraid to change the next slide, so.
Well, is this a discussion of policies and principles? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
It is.
I mean, more or less. Is it just one question, is it in the equation, is it that the fixed part, with certainty will be coming in, and you don't have that knowledge with the variable part because of seasonality? Is that enter the equation, or is that not part of it?
Everything's a part of it. I will say that. But we actually, if we get to it tonight, we have a few examples that will help, I think, crystallize some thinking on some of this a little bit. I'm not sure we'll get to it tonight, but we have some examples that will help facilitate everybody talking about fixed versus variable a little bit.
Okay, well, obviously, that's a key concern, so,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
wait till we get to that.
I mean, the whole purpose of having these talks is to get to
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
right? So we just don't need to get there right now. We need to get there after some discussion.
I hope that, it's one thing to touch on it broadly in this sort of general conversation, but it is my hope that we'll actually be able to dedicate targeted time to where we can actually get into those in a very specific way, and folks can come prepared, and we can hear the different philosophies and policy choices, because rate making is more an art than it is a science. And there's a lot of choices and decisions that people make in how they apply rates. And so I think people need to understand that it's not like this rigid mathematical formula that has to happen. There are policy decisions made upstream that then affect everybody downstream about how they're applied.
Well, and as part of these discussions, and I think I outlined where we were going with this eventually, is that after we go through some of these preliminary deals, we will actually talk about KUB's rates and talk about how we got where we are, why we are where we are, and how we compare to others. And people can fairly judge, okay, what if you did this, what if you did that, after we have an opportunity to explain it a little bit more. We just don't need to go to the end at the beginning.
Right.
Let's just make our way through here so a little bit. So, all right, so we start out talking about, okay, utilities financials are based upon their budget that's approved by the board. The budget really looks at a couple of different deals, rates, bonds, cash levels. If it's determined that rate adjustment is needed through that financial plan, then how do you go about doing it? We said there's a couple of big ticket sort of deals that defines what you can and can't do a little bit. The other thing is there's a lot of practices, if you will, that people follow, like we do here. For example, one of the things that we try to do is make our rates simple, particularly with residential customers. If you looked at an industrial rate, they are very, very complicated and takes many, many pages, whereas a residential rate, we try to keep them fairly simple. The simplicity is a good objective. Another objective we have in our rates is that, we have a long-range view of the world. That's how we do things. So if we're going to make a rate adjustment change, if you will, we do it gradually over time, over multiple years. We might have a little bit of change every single year to get to where we think we need to be, as opposed to making one big change at one time. Over time, we've learned from particularly talking to our business customers that they're not so concerned about necessarily us having the appropriate revenue, just like Dr. Smith said. What they are concerned about is having pre-notice and being able to budget for things. So the gradual approach to things, the foreknowledge of what we're doing, is something that's built into kind of our process. So historically, you would see our board most recently, for example, on the fiber vote that was just taken, the fiber rates actually go into effect in April. I think, is that right? Something like that. 1st of April. And the board voted that in September. So that's like a 9-month notice or something. And that's still too short for some of our customers. I specifically talked to one. They said, well, gosh, we just made our budget. Could you not wait for another year, sort of thing? But we try to do the best we can there. So anyway, there's a lot of different things we sort of look at just as we're thinking about rates that we try to take into consideration there. So again, let me jump back to the APPA, American Public Power Association, what their guidance is. Here's just 3 steps from them. These are kind of global steps, if you will. The first thing is to figure out how much you need in the form of rates. Compares, okay, here's your existing rates. How much revenue is that going to generate? And then you compare that to what you need to generate in order to finance your budget. So it's calculating out the revenue requirement, if you will. Then it moves into a cost of service that says, okay, of that revenue requirement, how do you allocate that cost to the various classes of customers? And then finally, the thing is to design, once you've done that, design the rates for that class of customer to fit that class's particular characteristics.
And Mike?
It's real global. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just, and again, not to go into that deep hole right now, but I think this is a piece that should be part of the deeper dive we do. It was not clear to us that, first of all, when we initially approached KUB about the fixed fee increases, we requested the cost of service study. There hadn't been a cost of service study done for a decade. So rates were going up, fixed fees were going up. They were not tied to a cost of service study. The cost of service study then was done. Y'all shared it, but it was never clear to us that there was a discussion with the board or with the general public that when you're doing cost of service studies, there are different methods that can be used, whether it's the minimum service method or whether it's the basic, there's several different ways that cost of service studies can be done. And so I'm not sure it was ever elevated that y'all were making choices in how you were actually doing your cost of service study with your consultant that naturally led you to a particular way of wanting to apply this. I think that we should have a discussion so that people have visibility that you can go in and do cost of service studies using different sort of policy levers and directives. And there is a lot of historic cost of service studies that have been done that have led to certain things. And then there's some newer ones that utilities are favoring because it does increase the amount of fixed fees, which get that guaranteed revenue. So when we do the deeper dive, I think it's going to be important to help educate everyone in the room that there's not like one way to do a cost of service study. And there's very intentional choices that are made in how you go and generate those things that then lead you to a conclusion from the cost of service study. So I hope that we can put that on the parking lot, so to speak, to talk about what are the various types of and methodologies of cost of service study and make sure everybody understands that's where the real artwork is done, because you're having to, again, apply to a bunch of different classes of customers and you're making choices, and those choices have implications.
Well, and as I described, at some future meeting, we are going to get to KUB Inc.
Yep.
and our rates over time and how decisions and what decisions were made and why they were made to reflect the rates that we're currently charging.
Right.
So that's clearly what we're going to try to provide so everybody can feel informed about why we are where we are. We're going to get there. So let me go to the next slide. Again, very high level, real quick here. I'm going to try to get some examples in a minute maybe. You determine the revenue requirement. We talked about that. You divide your revenue requirement either in energy or commodity, and then the distribution costs. And distribution is a word that's used for utilities because we distribute power or we distribute water or gas from a supplier, from a point to a customer. So we're a distributor. We distribute utilities. That's a word of art. Probably shouldn't use that. Then we categorize our costs between three different categories: customer-related costs, energy or commodity usage-related costs, and demand-related costs, which is something we're going to get into. Demand being the peak usage or the rate of usage is referred to as demand. And then we allocate costs to rate classes. All that's real generic, but I have a few examples here that hopefully we can start understanding this a little bit more than just me talking. So bear with me here because they're fairly simple examples. Here's the first one, and let me set the stage here by saying these examples are just numbers, and they're just round numbers to make them simple. There's nothing here that you can take and then I'll use it somewhere else other than some of the principles, hopefully, that you'll gain from this. But in this particular deal that I've constructed here, we've got a water plant up at the top there. That's what this is supposed to be. And that water plant is producing water for 50 cents per CCF, which is 100 cubic feet, or 742 gallons. It costs us 50 cents to produce that amount of water. Got one customer. This customer, in order to bill that customer and have a meter on that customer and read his meter and have somebody there ready to answer the phone with questions and all that kind of stuff, it cost us about $7 a month to provide that customer kind of cost to that customer. It costs us $10 to have the main, $10 on a monthly basis because you're financing it over time, $10 to provide the main going to the customer is the capital cost of serving. And this customer is using 5 CCF. That's how much they used. So if you were looking at, okay, how much is it costing us? And it's pretty simple. It's we've got to cover $10, we've got to cover the $7, and since they use 5 CCF, 5 times 50 cents, 250. So 250 and 7's 950 plus 10, 1950. So this customer, in this particular example, would need to pay the utility $19.50 to cover its costs, right? So the costs and the revenue match each other, just a real...
Hey, Mike, I know this is super simple, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna apologize in advance. When I see 50 cents per CCF, I'm thinking, taking the water out, cleaning it, the cost of the bacteria that eats the bad
That's right.
stuff. But then there is a massive sunk cost in the actual plant itself. So where is that treated? Is that in the 10? Is that baked into the 0.5? Is that
It's in
ignored?
the usage.
I think you can, we'll say it's in the 10.
Okay, for practical
This is
purposes.
very theoretical.
And I think that,
Yeah.
again, like, I've had the benefit of seeing your
Let me tell
wastewater
you
system,
a
like,
good way to
it's,
think of it, Aaron, is there are a lot of utilities that buy their water. We actually sell water to a couple of utilities ourselves, and they don't even have a treatment plant. They
Right.
just buy their water.
Right.
Think of this example, for example, we're just buying the water at 50 cents per CCF.
yeah. And I think
Makes it
the
easier.
reason I bring it up is because when I think of what it costs to run this system, that plant is like, forget the pipes underneath the ground and the fact that you have to dig them up and care for them and make sure there's not lead in them. That plant is a massive investment. So it put in perspective when I walked on that facility to say, wow, there is, I mean, again, what was it, $1.1 billion across the utilities? I mean, there's millions of dollars just in the actual infrastructure to get the water out of the river, much less the microbes to clean it and the chemicals to clean it and pump it and all of
Yeah.
those. So anyway, just appreciating that because you glossed over it, but it's a
Well,
pretty significant investment in our community.
Yeah. I wouldn't read any, all this is really just numbers for right now, but,
I'll put it in 10.
okay.
Hey, Mike, I wanted to ask a quick question.
Yes, sir.
I heard a figure years ago, and y'all may be able to answer this, but is it the equivalent of the 5 CCF for that particular residence? Is it about a penny per gallon what what TVA users pay?
It's about,
Is that too low, or?
it's about a half a cent,
Wow,
maybe 0.6 by now.
that's incredible. All right, yeah, that's an impressively low number.
Here's my example number 2, really sophisticated. You got two customers. They're exactly alike. They're just exactly the same as your other customer, right? Before we had one customer, now we got 2 customers. Everything's the same about them. They both have about $7 customer cost. They got $10 capital cost. They both use 5 CCF. They're both residential customers. And in both cases, the bill's $19.50, or the cost is $19.50, so you'd have to have a bill of $19.50. So one customer, now we got 2 customers. Now, in the case of utility, what happens in the case of utility is now those 2 customers are served by one utility. And so what happens? Well, the difference in this, they're still using 5 CCF each. They've still got customer costs associated with each. The cost per CCF is the same. The difference between the last example and this example is the capital cost is now $16 instead of before. It was $10 here and $10 there for a total of $20 capital cost. If you have a utility, what a utility does, and the reason why utilities are kind of monopolies, is that you don't have to have 2 trenches. You don't have to have double the investment, and there's just cost efficiencies associated with having one pipe serving 2 customers, if y'all can understand that. So there's only $16 capital cost now, as opposed to the two $10 capital costs. So if you were to go around this example here and add everything up, it's $7 plus $7 is $14, plus $16, that's $30, and 5 times 10 would be $5, so it would be $35. So the total cost on this example is $35. So now, I'm interested to hear what everybody thinks customer 1 ought to pay and what everybody thinks customer 2 ought to pay of this $35. And it's not a trick question at all. I'm just interested.
Which house you live in?
My kids are gone now, so I don't use that much, but, no, I mean, somebody throw out a number, or I can write it on the board or whatever. And it gets harder, so let's don't struggle on this one.
1750.
Pardon?
1750.
$17.50 a piece. You're talking about a piece count?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And the way you might get to that would be half of the $16, which is 8, plus 7, that's 15, and 5 times 50 cents is $2.50, so that's $17.50. And did I do my math right? That's what you were...
Yeah, sure, and
Yeah.
besides, you've got $16 in capital cost before it was
Right.
20, so you're subtracting 4 from both.
Yep.
2 from each then, and it was 1950 before.
Does anybody, if nobody else has anything different than that,
Well, I mean, you could slice and dice this several different ways, right?
I know, that's the reason why I
Yeah,
have it up
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. So one way to look at this is, what is the unique cost that each of those households individually, uniquely add to the system, right? And it is, you have the number at the customer cost being $7, which I assume is, like you described earlier, now I'm used to thinking of this in electrical terms. So in electrical terms, I would think of the line drop from the
Yeah,
transformer
and
to
the
the
reason,
house.
the reason I didn't do that, because I think everybody can understand pipes better than can
But
wires.
this, I think it applies here. You have whatever the costs are to get from the main trunk to the house, because that's unique to that house, because that house is the only one that's using it. You have the meter on that house, which is unique to the house. And then you have whatever the costs are that you all distribute over the billing system and all those other kind of things. That is the unique cost to the house. Okay? If that customer wasn't there, those costs wouldn't be there, right? So the rest of it is part of the common system that everybody uses. And, one theory of how you slice and dice this is that is put into the cost of the usage on a per gallon basis.
Well, which actually is part of the next example that we'll take a look at. But let me ask you then, do you have a different number than $17.50 each?
Well, I'd have to do the math based on whether, the question is, your number of it would be the application of this, I guess, the $16 in capital cost. I'm not quite sure why you went from $10 per trunk line to $16 per trunk line.
Just, I made that up, just economies of scale.
2 trunk lines is 1.
Yes.
Well, right, but the question is that, by going to 1, there is obviously an efficiency.
That's correct.
And so I'm assuming that you have accurately reflected that decreased cost, and then that and the water usage would be what you would come up with the rate. I'd have to do the math in my head to see whether it comes out to be the right amount. But I think the fact that you have customer cost at $7, and see, this is where this gets complicated, because theoretically, I don't know what the difference is. What if somebody only uses a mile of the trunk line because they're closer to the source, versus somebody that uses the trunk line that is 15 miles away? This is art of rate making. Do you apply the extra distance to that person that is more remote? Because technically, you've had to extend that trunk line, and theoretically, they should be carrying potentially more of the cost if you really want to get down to very specific. But you don't do that. I understand you don't do that.
Well, I tried to make this example as simple as I could.
Well, but
We start out with just one trunk
Yeah.
line, one house, and we said, okay, now we've got two identical houses, two identical everything. Now they're on the same pipe, and everything's identical about them.
well, it's not. One's
except you got
further
two.
out than the other.
No, but Dr. Smith, let me recognize that this is why we have municipal broadband coming, because that is what AT&T has done. They have served the customers that are close and easy, and they have not served the customers that are farther away.
But Aaron, yes, I agree with that to a certain degree. But when you're making the rates, you're making choices about how you are applying those things, right? And so this notion that sometimes we choose to give people preferential treatment to blend everything out, and then sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're willing to work with certain people at a disadvantage, sometimes we're not. This is my whole point, is there's a lot of variability that we can do. And so the choices you make here is an example, and this is the art of rate making, and this sort of notion that, well, we will do this for this person, but we may not do it for this person, or we're gonna bend the rules a little bit here, but we're not gonna bend them there. And saying that the way we're bending them is the way it's supposed to be. Let's just be honest.
No, sure, but I think what we picked up on, I think this was a great social experiment that Mike ran on us, was to say that our minds, at least my mind, I won't speak for anyone else, but my mind and at least Kent's mind, as the person who spoke up, went to an equal distribution of cost. Right. Yeah. And I think that, and I'm not the APP expert here, but I think that is the type of differential that I'm not going to use this term lightly, the public power model, which is very lowercase s socialist in nature, lends itself to do. So I think that you are totally correct to say, like, yeah, we could slice and dice this differently, but I think when we look at the public power model, this is actually where we start to all, again, me and Kent at least, gravitated toward an equal distribution,
But
because
we've talked about
Well,
slicing
and
and dicing it differently.
Yeah.
Well, what I haven't heard are what's the different numbers you want to throw up here? We've heard
Well, I
17,
think,
15,
let me say this,
17, 50.
I'm
What
gonna
are
jump
the other
in here.
numbers you wanna
I'm gonna
show?
jump in here. What you did, Dr. Smith, to me, I never thought about it. Because the first thing that popped in my head is the person that's closest to it pays less, the one that's further away pays more, because it takes more for me to maintain that line. And I can see your cost model, your variables, and how all that changes. Then I can come over here to Aaron and say, just keep it simple. And we all said we just split the difference and be done with it. But that may not work for everybody. And I'm going to say this. Mike, we're trying to get to the end of this thing so we can have these discussions. And the more we stay in this, the longer this thing, and I'm going to say it, it's going to drag out, because we do have ideas that we want to share, but we're not going to get there. It's going to be a long, long time. Because you're right. There are so many variables in this. But if we don't get to how you all look at it, why you look at it the way you look at it, we're just going to keep slowing us down to get there. Because I really want to know, I have a good understanding of what goes into your rates. I want to know how KUB puts their rates together. So I'm going to have to be patient and just wait. But that's where I am. I'm down here because I want to know how you build your rates. Then I can come back and say, here's a suggestion, here's a recommendation. So all of us are thinking different kind of ways, but I'm down that road saying, I want to see how your rates are.
You wanted to see the end.
But I'll be patient, we'll be good.
Well, let me apologize for not having these two come off the same line here. There wasn't meant to be
I never
miles
thought
between
about
these
that,
two.
too.
They were just two customers. So unless somebody says something different than 1750, I'm going to move on to the next example.
And let's keep in mind, we're, got like
Approaching time.
got about a minute, so.
Well, let me give one more example, and we'll leave it with that. Same example. Let's assume they're right across the street from one another. They're not 5 miles apart. I'm sorry I didn't draw them across the street from one another. The difference here is somebody had their kids move in with them. And now this house has got 10 CCF, and this house has 5 CCF. Everything's the same. One's using twice as much as the other customer. If you go around and you add it all up, it all adds up to $37.50 now, as compared to $35 it was a while ago. The question again to y'all is, what should customer 1 pay? Let's call this customer 1. What should customer 2 pay?
I think customer 1 should pay less if we're not going to have a true shared system here.
Is this one you're calling customer 1 or this one?
The 10 CCF.
Should pay less?
Yeah, because
Pay a little.
you're getting better utilization out of your system.
More specifically, how much would you charge this one of this
I
$37.50?
need to know what your cost is, or what your profit is, not what your cost. I guess your margin, if there is, I don't know if you guys have a profit or a margin, but,
I'm just trying to figure out how to slice this $37.50 in 2
well, I guess since
pieces.
you don't, I'm thinking from the private world.
Yeah,
If you
yeah,
don't
yeah.
have a margin, I
Yeah.
guess, I don't know.
No, we don't have a
Charge me
mar-
differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, but weren't we, when we did the bills, didn't you build in a higher, where does it kick up? I mean, I guess that's getting specific to KUB, but I think there are a lot of, a lot of questions there. And I guess I guess we could take another minute, but I just want to raise, I think, to me, these are really setting the stage for where we're going to get, in a way, and getting our thinking in order. I like to point, to me, what Aaron said was very persuasive in the broadband. Right now, if you want to get broadband and you're way out somewhere, okay, you can get it, it's going to cost you $2,000 for us to, right. I mean, that's the cost associated with getting the infrastructure out to you, which I doubt that will be the model that KUB will want to use as a public rather than a, private, paradigm, for lack of a better word. And so, and what Dr. Smith said, I mean, obviously, one way to do it is there really is more cost associated with you way out here, and eventually we're going to get to, okay, what are the implications to whom when you start building models, right? I mean, that's, you got discretion, and how are people impacted by these varying ways
Well,
to do
broadband is a little different in the sense that there's a sort of my understanding is you're only going to pump so much broadband through the fiber optic cables. Whereas for some of these others, and I'm, again, more knowledgeable for electricity, if you have a Mac mansion built out here in West Knoxville, and you've got a huge HVAC system that you keep at 65 degrees, and you're doing all this stuff, and on peak times, you're drawing a huge amount of power, that's costing KUB more than the person that may be in East Knoxville that's in a very small home and is very, trying to manage their costs and doesn't have that. But yet, the cost to the system may be very, very different. And so how you tease those apart, because if KUB has to then pay more, and we're not doing demand charges in the residential sector, the way they do that with industrial customers is through demand charges. But there's not a demand variable yet. And so, my question would be, on this trunk line, when those guys jumped up to 10 CCF, had you built that trunk line, what if you had to dig that trunk line up and put in a bigger pipe because all of a sudden a bunch of people were using a hell of a lot more water? Who should pay those costs?
That's the next example. we hadn't,
Yeah.
and it's too late to talk about it today, but we've got one suggestion that customer 1 ought to pay less. I don't know the dollar amount, and we can pick this up next week. your question about demand and larger pipes, next example, this one is, one customer's using more than the other. Should they pay ratably more? How much more should they pay? You know, what's the difference in cost between one customer and the other? I mean,
No, I think that's right. And so we've got one opinion that says that the customer that uses more should pay less, and another one that says the customer who uses more should pay more. So it's interesting because you're adopting two different value propositions to achieve two. And I think KUB acknowledges this too because of the time of use rates, which is basically adjusting the amount you pay depending on the cost of the system to
And
provide it.
do you want to send a market signal to your customers
Yeah.
so that you encourage efficiency, which is not reflected here?
yeah, all I'm trying to do is try to figure out how to slice up 3750 between two customers. I'm not trying to do anything else with that right there. There's no other time, there's no time to use.
What I said is if we weren't going to a true shared system, that you might look to that.
Yeah.
Because there's a revenue number you guys gotta hit to cover your overhead. If these guys are contributing more to cover that fixed cost, maybe they deserve a benefit. I think you guys give credit, out there in the field, when you look at what our potential usage is. You give us credit on our initial installation of some of the infrastructure, like meters and.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do take that into account in that manner.
So we still haven't really, and we could dig, like you say, to answer your question. We've gotten a couple of comments, but there's probably a lot more possibilities.
I know we're out of time.
Right.
I know we're out of time, no, but thank you, because what you've done is you've asked us to raise the question about what values we would use to ascribe different rates to those two customers. And I think that's the key thing.
Well-
And if we're a little bit uncertain about it now, I think no wonder. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Well, and I think that when we get back together, we can have some more discussion around just this example here to help set the stage for later talks about the bigger picture items that Dr. Smith wants to jump to. It's this kind of thinking right here we need to try to everybody at least understand
Right.
what the ends of the possibilities are. So,
Well, yeah, and charging, you got to get to the total, so.
Yes,
Implications
yes.
of one model for somebody then
Yes.
puts a different burden on others, and that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
The values that go into that. Well, okay, well, I appreciate everybody's not shuffling around looking to leave real obviously, so we've obviously, hey, you're in a classroom long enough, you know that feeling, you know. When it's about 5 minutes time to leave, they start shuffling books and putting them in bags and all that, so. Thank you for not doing that, and we will, I guess we're going to meet again, and we're meeting monthly, so we can get to this and not having a hardcore deadline on another topic. I think Tiki said we want to move to get to be able to deal with this with some dispatch, but on the other hand, I think not the discipline, but the practice we're getting into of answering these that are somewhat hypothetical here will work well when we aggregate it to a system level, and that's where the big questions will come in. So,
Yeah, the next meeting is scheduled for December the 2nd.
December 2nd.
So it's on,
okay.
it should be on your calendars already.
Okay. Excellent. Well, if there's nothing else, then everybody's okay. Why don't we consider ourselves adjourned?
All right. Thank you.